Because of my nephew, I never imagined that a night's sleep would result in the most exciting and sensual experiences of my life. Everything began during a demanding workday, the type that leaves your body feeling exhausted and causes every muscle to hurt. I had arrived home late and was too exhausted to consider having dinner. All I wanted to do was crawl into bed and let the world drift away for a few hours. With the exception of the faint glimmer from the hallway light beneath my bedroom door, the house was still and dark. I hardly had the energy to get dressed before I tucked myself between the blankets. The coolness of the bed greeted me, and I sighed deeply. Sleep rushed me as I closed my eyes, dragging me into that dreamless emptiness where time seems to have lost all significance. It had to be hours later. There was a slight change in the atmosphere when I felt it, something that pulled at the periphery of my consciousness without completely waking me up. I initially believed I was having a dream. Something was moving in the room, but it was so faint that my mind was unable to fully process it. I was floating about in that area, half sleeping, between the actual world and my dream, and I hardly noticed the door's gentle creak as it opened a crack, but then something occurred. I could feel the weight change on the bed next to me, the faint pressure of someone sitting down, and a touch on my arm that was as soft and warm as a whisper of heat against my skin. My thoughts whirled with bewilderment, half dreaming, partially conscious as the warmth went through me. My heart raced, though I wasn't really sure why. It was so gentle that I wasn't even sure it was real. There was only a strong feeling of something unsaid between us, neither worry nor dread. I remained where I was. I didn't want the moment to be broken. Want to admit that this might not have been a dream at all. Then I felt a steady, firm hand resting lightly on my shoulder. The touch gave me a shock, but I stayed motionless, breathing shallowly as I tried to figure out what was going on. Was I dreaming? My eyelids slowly opened. It was only an illusion of my weary brain. I looked over and saw my nephew Dominic sitting next to me on the bed, squinting against the low light coming in. My pulse was thumping in my chest. He was silent, his face inscrutable as he gazed down at me, my breath stuck in my throat, his hands still on my shoulder. "How are you?" I spoke a barely heard murmur. Dominic remained motionless and did not remove his hand, and his focused gaze and half-shaded face were audible through the haze of sleep. However, there was a hint of something that made my stomach turn in ways I couldn't quite pinpoint. He replied in a calm, low voice, "I didn't mean to wake you. I simply couldn't." Rest. Not knowing what to say, I nodded. It was hard to think clearly because of the way he was staring at me and the subdued tension in the room. He had been helping out around the house while staying with me for a few weeks, and although we had always been close, this time was different. "I didn't intend to enter in this manner," he went on, his hand dropping from my shoulder, but not very far. "I don't know, but I simply needed to be here." His words hung heavy between us, and I could feel my heart pounding. Even more quickly, there was something unsaid, something boiling under the surface that neither of us wanted to admit, but with the way he was staring at me and the way his body seemed to be drawn to mine, it was hard to ignore. I sat up a little and propped myself against the headboard, shifting slightly beneath the blankets as the fabric rustled quietly. We just sat for a while as Dominic's eyes tracked my movements, his stare unwavering. The silence of the room was weighed down on us by the weight of all that was unsaid. I eventually broke the stillness with a calm voice, "I don't mind. It's acceptable if you have to speak." There was something more, something deeper, something I hadn't noticed in Dominic's smile, even if it didn't quite reach his eyes. His forehead was wrinkled as he looked down at his hands tinkering with the blanket's edge, but after a prolonged silence, he said, "I don't know what's going on with me. I've been having unidentified feelings, and I wasn't sure who else to confide in." His comments made me shudder, and I sensed the tension between Spike and me. I wasn't sure what he meant or where this conversation was going. The weight of his stare on me, however, was palpable, as were the unsaid feelings that lingered between us. "Dominic," I spoke cautiously at first, not sure how to go. "You may discuss whatever you want with me," he said, nodding while his hands continued to fumble with the blanket. Despite understanding the reason for my visit, I find myself unable to articulate my thoughts. I gulped hard, trying to make sense of the situation while my thoughts raced. His tone of speech had gotten softer, and something about the way he was staring at me caused my chest to constrict. I wanted to ask him what was on his mind and encourage him to express his feelings, but I was terrified of the response. Dominic looked up at me and then peered into my eyes, hoping for understanding or some form of confidence. He said, "I've been thinking about you." As he spoke softly, barely audible, about us, my heart pounded. For a brief minute, I was unable to breathe because I couldn't mistake the significance of what he was saying or the intensity of his look. This wasn't simply a late-night talk. Something more complex, and I wasn't sure I was prepared to deal with it. I'm not sure what that implies. Though my voice revealed the perplexity and anxiety churning within me, I muttered. As Dominic drew in closer, his palm touched mine, sending a shockwave through me. "I don't want to pretend anymore," he muttered. His tone was calm yet passionate. "I don't want to pretend that I don't feel this, or that we don't both feel it," but the silence that followed Dominic's words seemed to go on forever, heavy and thick, filling the space between us. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and I could feel the tension building in my chest as I tried to process what he had just said. This was my nephew, someone I had known since he was a child, and now he was sitting here telling me things that I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. Dominic's hand was still lightly on mine, and his touch sent waves of heat through my own, making it difficult for me to think clearly. My mind whirled with confusion and desire, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a lead blanket. I wanted to pull away from whatever it was, but there was a part of me that couldn't deny the pull. "This is tricky," Dominic said, and I began speaking shakily toward him, uncertain of how to react. His gaze remained fixed on me as he nodded. "That doesn't make it any less genuine," he replied quietly, his voice relaxed in spite of the tension in the room. "I have attempted to fake and dismiss it. I can't anymore, even though it seemed to be in my thoughts." My throat was dry as I swallowed hard. As I struggled to find the correct words, I realized that I had never been in this risky situation before, but here we were, sitting in the dark, with feelings that had been brewing for an unknown amount of time just under the surface. "I'm not sure whether we should." I allowed my thoughts to wander. "It's not possible for this to occur, really." Dominic's hand, which was solid but soft, tightened slightly on me. "What's the point?" His question was barely audible. Above a whisper, "What is really stopping us?" I couldn't respond that there were a million reasons why this was wrong, why it shouldn't even be a thought in our minds, but none of them felt strong against the connection I felt between us. I wanted to say that it was because he was my nephew, and that crossed every boundary imaginable, but the intensity in his eyes and the way he was staring at me made all of those arguments seem weak. "We can't overlook the fact that you're my nephew, Dominic." I took a long breath to help me settle myself and prevent my voice from shaking. "It's not that easy," he said, nodding once more as his face softened a bit. "I know it's not easy, but that doesn't change how I feel." His words sparked a surge of excitement in my heart, and a familiar warmth enveloped me. There was something about his conversational style and the quiet resolve in his voice that made it impossible to doubt the veracity of what he was saying. For him, this was more than a passing emotion. It was genuine. "I don't want things to go strange." Almost inaudibly, I said, "I don't want to ruin our relationship between us." "You won't," Dominic murmured hastily as his palm moved to cup the side of my face and his thumb softly touched my cheek, a kind touch. Tender, yet it made me shudder. "I also don't want to damage anything. To be really honest with you, I want to quit acting like I briefly closed my eyes, attempting to calm my breathing and try to understand the feelings that were roiling inside of me. When I opened my eyes, the weight of the understanding made my chest clench, and even though he was my nephew, he didn't feel like family at that time. Instead, he felt like something deeper and more significant. Once more, Dominic continued to observe me with a vulnerable and open face. I didn't want to leave without thinking, so I leaned forward, my heart thumping in my chest as I drew closer to him. For a moment, everything else vanished, leaving just the two of us in the silent stillness of the night. Dominic immediately responded, his hand slipping from my face to the back of my neck, drawing me closer. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, and I felt a rush of heat. It was his vulnerability that did it. I couldn't handle the intensity of the moment or the unexpected ways his touch made my skin thrill as our bodies crushed against one another. Both of us pulled away. Quietly, Dominic whispered, "I didn't know how to tell you." His words impacted me profoundly, causing a wave of emotions to surge up within me. I was breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to catch our breath. The weight of what had just happened was racing through my mind and heart, and while I should have felt guilty or overwhelmed with shame, all I felt was a strange sense of relief, as if we had finally let go of something that had been building between us for so long. For him, this wasn't a passing moment. It was more than a fleeting notion. He had been suppressing this for longer than I had believed, and now that it was public knowledge, there was no turning back. "I'm not sure what this implies." With my voice quivering a little, I whispered, "I don't know. Where does this go?" Dominic replied quietly, "We don't have to figure it all out right now. We can take it slow. We don't have to rush anything," while keeping his hand on the back of my neck and his thumb lightly grazing my skin. His remarks made me feel calmer than I had anticipated. The silent agreement that we would work this out together, one step at a time, was all that was present. I took a nod. I'm still trying to process everything that happened, and my heart is pounding. We were both unfamiliar with this, and although it was challenging, it didn't feel incorrect. Felt correct. After a time, the weight of everything we had previously kept to ourselves eventually subsided, and the quiet between us seemed comfortable. Despite not moving, Dominic's fingers fell off my neck. Up until the early hours of the morning, he remained by my side, his presence steady and warm, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in years. I knew that we needed to figure out what to do next, but for the time being, it didn't matter because what mattered was that we had stopped hiding and stopped acting like we had stopped, and we would deal with whatever came next. United, but that was only the beginning of the narrative. My mind was repeating everything that had happened, and the weight of the previous night lingered in the air, a mixture of feelings that I still hadn't fully absorbed. The morning light came in through the curtains, creating gentle shadows across the room. Dominic hadn't returned to his own room, so I was left to think alone, but despite everything that had been said, there was still a subtle but noticeable tension between us as I lay in bed and gazed up at the ceiling, wondering what the day would hold. Were we really going to act as though nothing had changed? My heart raced at the thought of confronting him this morning, fearing what he might say or do. Would he regret it? Could we return to the way things were before I had doubted it? Everything changed the minute I kissed him, and there was no turning back. Will I? I couldn't remain inside. Dead for all time. After a while, I got up, put on a shirt, and went downstairs. The house was still, and for a second I thought perhaps Dominic had already left for the day, perhaps he had gone to seek some space, or to clear his head, but as I turned the corner into the kitchen, I saw him. The sight of him sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and gazing out the window made my stomach turn. I had to remind myself to take a breath. Dominic replied gently morning. He glanced up when he heard me come in, and for a time, neither of us spoke. The stillness was dense with all that had been kept silent. His voice, which broke the quiet, was calm but nevertheless included a hint of the anxious energy I had been experiencing in the morning. My voice was a touch harsh as I responded. I had no idea how to behave. Did we discuss it at this point? Did we act phony? Everything was as usual. I was feeling uneasy and unsure of how to handle this new situation between us, Dominic said, pointing to the coffee pot on the counter. I have an idea that you might find useful. Although it seemed a little strained, I grinned. I poured myself a cup and took a seat at the table across from him. Thank you. Dominic was trying to keep things light and make this morning feel as normal as possible, but we both knew it wasn't after a few quiet moments of sipping. Dominic cleared his throat and put his cup down with a gentle clink, so last night my heart skipped a beat at what he said, and I swallowed hard, preparing myself for whatever was coming. Next, he said, his eyes seeking, I don't want you to feel weird about it. Not because I regret it, but because I don't want you to believe that I'm pregnant. Among us, his words lingered, anything you know more than what you're ready for, and a wave of relief passed over me. His candor helped to ease the situation, but I'm not sure what I was expecting him to say. He was allowing me the freedom to work things out at my own pace without pressuring me or seeking anything in return. In a scarcely audible voice, I said, "I don't regret it either. I'm still trying to figure it out, though." Dominic gave his face a nod. I recognize that this is something new for us both. I drew in my breath. "I have no idea why my fingers are curling up around the cup in front of me," I said, "but I don't want to lose you, Dominic," repeating the ideas that had been racing through my head all night. "I'm not. It won't." He responded firmly, "Whatever happens, we'll work it out together." He leaned forward, his hand resting gently on the table, his fingers grazing mine. He didn't want this to ruin our relationship. His remarks made me feel calmer than I had anticipated. It wasn't an easy scenario, but we didn't have to jump right into anything, and it didn't have to be as complex as I had imagined. Without placing any pressure on ourselves, we could take our time and figure out what this was. I briefly considered reaching out to touch Dominic to bridge the gap between us as his hand hovered close to mine. Dominic replied after a bit, reclining back in his chair with a slight smile, like I had last night, but I held back, unsure if it was the right time instead. I smiled softly at him, grateful for his understanding and his patience. "Does this imply that I can ask you out?" I paused, taken aback by the abrupt change in tone, and then I couldn't help but laugh. It was just what I needed, light and refreshing. My response caused Dominic's smile to broaden, and I felt a little lighter as I raised an eyebrow in jest. "You're not kidding." With a shrug, he maintained his smile. "What's the point? People do this because they go on dates, get to know one another, and we can see what occurs." The thought didn't sound as absurd, but I shook my head, still grinning. Way I believed it could. In fact, the more I considered it, the more I realized that it would make more sense for us to investigate whatever it was that exists between us, maybe proceeding slowly like we would in a typical relationship. Just what we required. "Let's go on a date," I murmured, my heart finally pounding with the choice. Dominic's eyes brightened, and I felt a wave of warmth come over me as I saw his excitement. "Actually, it's okay. Let's take our time and work things out," I said, feeling more confident every second. Dominic's palm eventually closed over mine as he reached across the table, his hold solid yet soft. He remarked, "I'm looking forward to it." We didn't have to rush or know all the answers. We just needed to be here together and take things one step at a time. However, as the days passed, things between us began to feel more natural and comfortable, and we settled into an easy rhythm. His voice was gentle but full of meaning, and as I looked at him, my chest tightened with emotion. Because I knew that this was the beginning of something neither of us had expected, but something that felt right. We didn't push it. Instead, we kept things slow, letting the moments unfold naturally without forcing anything there. Dominic and I spent more time together talking, laughing, and sharing meals, and occasionally there would be a gentle touch, a lingering glance, or a brush of hands that sent a shockwave through me. This replaced the tension that had once weighed so heavily between us. There was no haste, no desire to jump into something we weren't prepared for, and I discovered a calmness I hadn't anticipated in that area, in the gradual development of whatever was developing between us. Dominic held my hand as we sat on the porch one evening as the sun was setting and the entire area was bathed in a warm, golden glow. "We're doing this, aren't we?" His fingers entwined with mine as I turned to face him, and my heart swelled with the quiet intensity of the moment. My voice was barely above a whisper as I asked. Dominic grinned, his eyes wide and kind, of something more profound than words could convey. "Yes," he said, "we are, and for the first time, I was positive that we would face whatever came next together." Dominic and I settled into a new normal as the days stretched into weeks. There was no strain or hurry. To clarify what was going on between us, and that provided me with a sense of security I wasn't aware I needed. The connection, which had previously been strictly familial, had evolved into something more profound, which we both recognized without coercion. We were just working things out together as we went along, but the narrative doesn't stop there. Dominic has the ability to make things seem simple. Slowly but surely, we allowed ourselves to lean into the unspoken connection that had always existed between us. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of pink and orange, I realized just how much everything had changed. My dates, as he called them, were simple walks through the park, late-night conversations over a few beers, or sometimes just sitting in the living room watching old movies and sharing quiet moments. Since Dominic had arrived that evening, we had changed as individuals. I felt a sense of serenity that I hadn't had in years as I sat next to him, his hand resting softly on mine, and we both confessed sentiments that we didn't completely comprehend at the time. "Do you recall the times we spent here after supper?" I nodded and smiled as Dominic inquired, breaking the easy stillness between us. "You were just a kid," I said. "You used to have a ton of inquiries concerning the stars back then." With a gentle giggle, Dominic squeezed my hand. "I suppose I've always been interested in stuff." The way he said it made my heart skip a beat. It served as a reminder of how far we had come, how much we had changed, and how much more we had yet to discover as the sun sank, bathing everything in a gentle golden glow. Dominic turned to face me, his face solemn but loving. My breath stopped in my throat as he continued, "I've been thinking, in a softer tone, about us and how this has been evolving." I felt the usual rush of nervousness mixed with eagerness. "Yeah," he said, nodding, his eyes searching mine. "I don't want to keep holding back, even if we have taken the time we promised to. I am not interested in pretending that I am unaware of my feelings toward you." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning, and I felt my heart race in response. We had been dancing around this for weeks, giving ourselves time to get used to the new dynamic between us, but Dominic's words laid everything out. "But I don't want to hold back either," I said softly, my voice shaking. "Little, but it's still challenging." There was a glimmer of melancholy in Dominic's grin. "Although I am aware of that, our situation is equally genuine. I don't want to continue acting as though it's not real." I swallowed forcefully. Suddenly dry, he was correct. We couldn't continue to skirt the issue. Even though the connection between us had been growing for a while and the sentiments between us were genuine and unquestionable, I hadn't yet fully admitted it or spoken it aloud. "This is the first time I felt this way," I said in a barely audible murmur. "Not like this." Dominic's fingers closed tightly around mine, his thumb lightly grazing my flesh. "I don't, but that's why it's worthwhile, right?" His genuine eyes and his voice's calm certainty made my chest constrict with passion. There was no doubting it longer. I quietly responded, my heart pounding. I wanted this. I wanted him more than anything else, and for the first time I felt prepared to give up on it. Dominic is smiling in my chest, his eyes melting with relief, and before I could speak another word, he moved in and slowly pressed his lips to mine. And full of everything we hadn't spoken aloud. His hand went to slash my face, drawing me in closer as I melted into him and let the moment's weight overwhelm me. This time, there was no hesitancy or second-guessing. The world outside seemed to vanish as the kiss became deeper, and I felt his arms encircle me, keeping me close. "I love you," Dominic whispered, his hands still gently cradling my face. The words came out so naturally and effortlessly that I didn't even have time to process them before they hit me like a tidal wave. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a rush of emotion rise inside me. The warmth of his body against mine and the feel of his lips moving against mine was overwhelming, but in the best way possible. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless. I knew that was true, even if it was the first time we had both stated it out loud. Hearing him say that, hearing those words come out of his mouth, made everything seem much more genuine, even if I had known for some time, even if I hadn't allowed myself to completely admit it. Dominic's grin was warm and gentle as I muttered, "I love you too." My voice was shaking with the weight of what I was saying. Then he kissed me once again, more slowly, tenderly, like though he was enjoying the moment. And I gave him a kiss in return, feeling the reality of what he had said sink into my chest and ground me in a manner that had made the days that followed seem like a dream. Everything was lighter and simpler now. That we had finally spoken what we had been suppressing for so long, we no longer needed to hide our emotions. We were together, and that was all that mattered, so we didn't have to question or second-guess anything anymore. Spending more time outside, we spoke about everything and nothing, sometimes not at all, while strolling through the fields or lounging by the lake. One evening, the bond between us was stronger than words, so we didn't have to. Dominic snuggled up next to me in bed, his head resting on my chest. I found myself wondering about the future, but I was no longer terrified. I had no idea what it would hold or how we would eventually work through the difficulties in our relationship. I knew we would face whatever happened next together. Dominic moved a little, putting his hand on my chest, and I glanced down at him as a wave of love passed over me. Though his eyes were half closed, he was looking up at me with a contentedness and a calmness that I had never seen in him before. His voice was soft but full of emotion as he said, "I don't want this to ever end." "It won't," I answered, my voice firm and confident. "We can succeed, Dominic." As he sank closer to me, he smiled and closed his eyes, and I felt a wave of peace wash over me. Even if the outside world might not comprehend what we had, it made no difference. What mattered was that we had found something genuine and worthwhile, and I had a deep-seated conviction that we would overcome any obstacles that stood in our way.